All right. Just a brief background on my pumpkin production background. I do raise pumpkins in the Waterloo area, so in Monroe County, just south of the south side of the Metro East St. Louis area. And I do no-till transplanted pumpkins, and I'll get into some of the details of that. And I have some pictures. I think that'll kind of fill in some of the things that Mike was talking about as well. So we'll just go ahead and jump right on into this. So to start off with, the importance of weed management. So weed pumpkin plant competition can really severely reduce yields. So that's why we really want to pay good attention to this. If we talk about all the other pests that can be a problem, and since Rick isn't on here and Muhammad isn't around, I can say that probably in the bottom line, and Rogi highlighted this, weeds are probably your most limiting. Sometimes we don't think about them because we just naturally, we always know we're going to have to do something. But if you don't do anything to control weeds, you probably don't need to worry about applying insecticides and fungicides, because, and that's saying that you don't hoe, you don't do anything, because you're probably not going to have to have a whole bunch of plants there. Weeds can also limit air movement. A lot of these diseases, you need to have, these humid conditions can be impacted more by having lots of weeds. You don't have good airflow through those pumpkin leaves. And also weeds can harbor insects and also pathogens. I didn't put that on there, but those are, so insects and diseases can, can be harbored in there. You can have plants that have a disease within them, and then those are nearby on a field edge, and then an insect moves that disease or what have you, so they harbor all kinds of things that can be problematic. And then just from a physical standpoint, they can reduce and interfere with your spray coverage for your pesticide applications. Mike talked about whenever you have different mechanisms of getting those products, those insecticides and fungicides actually onto the pumpkin, you want to make sure that you can actually get to them. Well, if you have a lot of weeds, that is going to just be one more thing that's going to hinder you getting good coverage, and good coverage, as Mike said, is really essential. So if you have poor weed management, which this picture is an example of, as you can see in this case, you can see why. How many of you want to go into that and pick pumpkins out of that? Not to mention there won't be much to pick, because this is the kind of harvest you're going to get if you have, field conditions that look like that. Now, if you have good weed management, or at least better, here you can at least actually see those are pumpkins out in the distance there. You can get harvest measured a little bit more like this. And I think which would you much rather have? Would you much rather have those couple green pumpkins and orange ones, or do you want to have wagon loads of pumpkins? Hopefully the wagon loads would be a little bit more, especially if you're trying to produce them to sell. So here are some problematic weeds in pumpkins. This is not specific and necessarily a limitation of the only ones. These are just some of them that can be most problematic. I'm sure there's more. Any weed can be problematic. Probably most important are we call the amaranthus species. So this includes things like your pigweeds you have in your garden, water hemp. Palmer amaranth is another one. They're all in the same family. They're closely related, but all yet a little bit different. These are ones that are broadleaf weeds that are a very big issue. So, and they germinate throughout the summer, so it's a constant struggle. Morning glories are another. They also germinate across the summer, and because morning glories vine and you have a vine crop, you get a intermingling of vines, and it just kind of can lead to a nightmare. Hop hornbeam copperleaf. I don't know that you have this as much up north. We have it some down here. That is actually the picture you see down in the bottom corner. That is hop hornbeam copperleaf. It's more common down here. You see it a lot in especially corn and soybean fields late in the year. The problem, if you have it, it's a problem because it germinates in basically from June through October. So it will keep coming up, and as you can see, it's kind of bushy in growth, and it can provide a lot of competition to pumpkins. The ragweed species are also common ragweed, giant ragweed. Some places they call these horseweed. They're called giant ragweed is an issue. Crabgrass and foxtail, so grass species, are also very competitive. And also volunteer small grains. If you look at that picture in the corner, you can see that that was actually taken in my pumpkin field. You can see some volunteer wheat coming up around there. So that can also be a major issue. So those are things you need to think about. Just a real kind of a quick overview. What are some common strategies for weed management? So there's 4 main categories you can kind of break things into, and that would be herbicides, and there are some organic products also that can be used as spot sprays and things, or conventional herbicides. Cover crops, and usually that's a lot of times with no-till production. Those are also very important, and I'll get into a little more detail on this later. Tillage and cultivation is also used quite prevalently. And also hand weeding or hoeing. And as Mike said, and I will vouch for that, no matter what your weed management system, a hoe and pulling weeds or hand weeding to a certain extent is probably going to be a part of your weed management plan in a certain perspective. So the next section, I'm going to run through a list of the common herbicides, talk about each of them. And I apologize to some of the organic growers up there. I didn't know what my audience would be. I promise I won't try to dwell on these too much, but this is a major part of that. But don't worry, I will jump into cover crops and happy to talk about those later as much, and other options as much as we can. But so here's a list of some common herbicides. These are not all of the labeled herbicides. And I don't know if you have it there. For the group here, I copied off, I think it's page 107 out of the current fruit and vegetable, or not fruit and vegetable, vegetable production guide, which gives you a really nice table of the herbicides that are labeled and how they're labeled for use. So make sure to refer to that for more details and also additional details on rates. Some things to consider before we jump into this whenever you're using herbicides. First, identify problematic weeds. A lot of times people say, I have a weed problem, what can I spray? The first question I'll ask is, what weed's the problem? Because herbicides all work for either different weeds or and they have different levels of selectivity. Some control all weeds, some only control certain broadleaves, etc. So you need to know there is no general fix just to spray anything and it just kills everything that you don't want. So you need to know what it is. At a minimum, you need to know if it's a grass, a broadleaf, or a sedge. And especially when you get into the broadleaves, you really need to know what is it. Is it a morning glory? Is it a ragweed? Is it is it a pigweed? Those are all important things because each of those weeds grows in a little bit different fashion or has a different size seed, and that means that there's probably going to be a different means to best control it. Herbicides do have a potential for crop injury, and this is kind of an inherent risk that we do have to deal with. It's something that it can be, something you don't want to deal with, but the benefits outweigh these potential risks. Sometimes, usually, crop injury is fairly limited and it's temporary. Maybe the plants are stunted a little bit, but compared to trying to hand weed acres of pumpkins, it really has some great benefits. So make sure you follow the labeled guidelines. That's as far as rates and things, that will ensure that you have the best chance of not having any injury. And some compounds have a greater potential for injury than others. And understand the risk with each individual herbicide. As I said, they're different. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go to some specific products. Potential carryover to future crops. Some herbicides that have residual can potentially, if you're wanting to plant right after that, or maybe the next year, typically with pumpkins, it isn't as big of an issue because a lot of times we're not planting something in the fall after them, but that is something always to consider. Pre-emergence herbicides usually need either rainfall or they need to be incorporated to actually work. So if these are herbicides that kill seeds before they germinate, they need to get into the soil in some fashion. So if you're spraying and we have one of those Julys where we don't have any rain, if you don't have rainfall within a week after you spray something, you might need to just know that that product might not be as effective as you would hope, so you may have to go to other approaches later in the season. And a quick note, generic herbicides. There's a lot of them out there. They can be equally effective and a lot of times more cost effective. When I've talked about the ones here, I've listed the primary commercial trade name just to keep it simple, and I've listed the active ingredient, and you can look further for what you're needing. But check the label if you're using a generic for different rates or adjuvant needs. So if you see a rate for, say, Gramoxone in the guide, make sure, because there's different, what we call different formulations of Gramoxone. Some of the generics have more or less of that active ingredient in them, so the rate might not be the same. So just because you see the same product, make sure that they recommend the same rate, so that way you're putting things down appropriately. So I'm going to just take a little bit of time and run through each of these herbicides and kind of ways they can be used and some little notes about them. First one, Gramoxone Inteon. The active ingredient is paraquat. So if you look on the label, that's what it will contain as far as the active ingredient. It is non-selective, so it will kill anything, any vegetation. It is a contact, so it just kills the leaves and things that are there. It does not move down into the roots, and it has absolutely no residual in the soil. So after you spray it, it kills what's there, and it won't kill anything that will emerge in the future. When can you use it? As a burn down, or is labeled to use as a post-directed spray. So you can spray it. When we talk about post-directed, that's basically what that means, is that you're spraying it while the crop is there, but you're directing it away from the crop and keeping it from getting on the pumpkin plant. Notes, make sure you use a recommended adjuvant. You do need to have, basically it's like an oil or a surfactant you need to add with it to make sure that it has maximum effectiveness and gets into the plant, so make sure you look at that. And it's good on annual weeds, especially those resistant to glyphosate, things like mare's tail and water hemp, which can be issues, especially if you're in rotating in a commercial corn and soybean rotation. And next, Roundup PowerMax, and of course this is glyphosate. And as I say, there's many generics available. This is Monsanto's, the premier original version that they have on the market now, but there at almost any store you can find some form of glyphosate or Roundup, as we generically tend to call it. It is also non-selective. It is systemic, so it moves into the roots of the plant. But it has absolutely no residual. As soon as you spray Roundup, it gets into the plant. It does not stick in the soil. It won't kill seeds that haven't emerged, and it will not do anything for weeds that have not come up. So that's why it has good utility as far as ahead of planting. So you can use it as a burn down or post-directed. But I will stress, do not get any on the leaves, as it will cause injury. If we move back, just thinking about Gramoxone, the nice thing about it is it is not systemic. You can get a little bit on a leaf, and it burns a little hole in the leaf, and the plant really doesn't know any better. Since Roundup is systemic, depending on how much you get on it, some cases you won't really have any injury. I have seen instances though, and it usually seems to be my luck whenever I use Roundup, is I get a little bit on one leaf, and what it does tend to do is it tends to hurt flower sets, and even sometimes flowers will abort, and it'll put unnecessary stress on the plant. So even though the plant might still be growing, you might be kind of losing some yield by having that extra stress as that plant is trying to overcome and get through that. Good on annual, perennial weeds, except for those that have resistance. Next is dual Magnum or dual 2 Magnum. Active ingredient is metolachlor or S-metolachlor. It is strictly residual. So what it does is it prevents weeds from germinating. It can be used, it's labeled for pre-emergence or post-directed between rows only, and there's a note I'll talk about on the pre-emergent side. As far as what it'll control, it's good on grasses and also small seeded broadleaves, such as water hemp, which is an issue. Also really good on nutsedge, which is another weed problem. And it has really good crop safety. This is one that, I don't know, Mike, have you seen any issues with having any injury from dual?
No, not.
All right, that's been my observation as well. So it has really good crop safety. Some of the other compounds do have some more potential for injury. So going back to what the label says, I'm going to kind of stand out on a limb a little bit here. The label says for dual Magnum or dual 2 Magnum, either one is labeled, and just a quick kind of commercial on this is that if you're growing sweet corn, and you maybe want to use dual Magnum and that's labeled in many other row crops, get dual 2 Magnum because dual 2 has the safener to apply with corn. Whereas dual Magnum is more of a soybean compound, so it gives you a little extra utility. Either one, I looked, the labels say the same thing for pumpkin, so it doesn't really matter. So what the label says is that they recommend you spray that you do not spray directly over the planted row whenever you spray. They're saying to leave a 1 foot untreated area over the row. And so the challenge with that is how many people are going to want to go through and spray a couple acre field with, and leave 1 foot over every row where you're going to spray. Well, unfortunately, that's not as practical. And dual is probably one of the best products that we have for weed control. But what it does say, if you go on further, is that dual applied as a broadcast over the plant may increase the risk of injury. So more or less, my interpretation, and Mike, I'd be happy to hear yours, is that ideally, especially if you're planting, this is their recommendation. You can increase the risk of injury. So more or less, this is their legal disclaimer as to, you can do it, but we're not liable for it. I will say personally, it does not tell you that it does not prohibit you from making broadcast sprays. It just doesn't recommend it specifically. So not to get off on a tangent on this, but I don't know, Mike, if you don't mind saying, if you use dual, how do you apply it? Do you do a banded?
Hey, Mike's coming up here, and then we got a question for you too after Mike answers. How do you use dual?
Yeah, Nathan, we just broadcast it. We have for years and never seen a problem with it. I look at pumpkins being such a large seeded crop and 2.5 inches, 2 inches deep, being very low risk.
And hold on, Nathan, we got a question.
Sure. No, okay, sure.
Right.
Okay. Question, if you put down the plastic ahead of your spray, would that protect that band?
Did you catch that, Nathan?
Yeah, I did. So if you're going to put down black plastic, there are certain compounds, and I don't think dual has any restrictions on that. I think, I want to say that strategy, which is another one I'm going to talk about, I think does have some restrictions about not using it under plastic. You wouldn't necessarily want to apply under the plastic. Some things you can. Hopefully, my thought is when you have that herbicide under the plastic, you have a completely different environment because you don't have rainfall under it, which is essential for dual, among others. So those herbicides can react differently. So I kind of discourage people from making, at least on some of these compounds, for pumpkin production anyhow, for making applications ahead of putting down plastic, just because hopefully your plastic will do the majority of the good. If you want to make an application after you put down the plastic, so say for the row middles or something, you could. Also, whenever you disturb the soil, when you form the beds for the plastic, you're going to completely lose almost all of your, or a lot of your effectiveness for the dual, because it will more or less mix around. And dual is best on a like in a no-till situation. It does not need to be incorporated. It needs rainfall, but it doesn't need so much incorporation like running a tiller or something through it. So does that kind of answer your question?
Hold on. We're going to see if we answered that one.
Okay. My idea was you put down the plastic first, then you take your boom sprayer and go over the whole thing.
Okay.
Well,
so you're not talking about putting having herbicide under the plastic, so say applying it and then putting plastic over it. You're just okay. Yeah, no, that'd be fine. Sorry if I misinterpreted your question. But no, yeah, you could certainly do that and go over the top. It's not going to hurt the plastic or do anything, if it gets on the plastic, and it will provide then the same weed control aspects in between plastic rows. So no, the bottom line, and just from my knowledge of how herbicides work, I think dual Magnum personally, I think is a very safe compound, both for transplanting and direct seeding. So I just wanted to kind of address some of that that information, just so that people weren't kind of shied away from using it just because of that. So I'll run through some of the others. So strategy. It is chromosome and ethylfluorine. It's just a residual only for pre-emergence. Good on grasses and select broadleaves. Command 3-ME. So this is chromosome alone. So this is basically part of that previous compound. It is just residual activity. Good on grasses and select broadleaves, but note that it is only labeled for processing pumpkins. So it's not labeled for jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, but I did want to at least throw it in as one that was listed. Sandia, this is one that is another one that's used fairly commonly. Active ingredient is hale sulfuron. It does have some foliar activity and also residual activity, and it is a systemic compound. It can be used either pre-emergence or post-emergence, and either can cause crop injury. So this is one that does have a strong potential for causing crop injury, but it does provide some good level of weed control. It's very good on broadleaf, and it's excellent on nutsedge, especially foliar-controlled nutsedge. But be very careful not to over-apply, and as injury will increase as your rate would increase. So good sprayer calibration, no overlap, things like that are very important. Select Max. Select Max is clethodim. It is a selective compound. It only controls grasses. It's systemic and has no residual, so it won't control non-emerged weeds. It is for post-emergence application, so after the weeds and pumpkins are up. It is good on all grasses, especially when has better results when grasses are small. Make sure to note it does some of the generic versions. Arrow is one sometimes you see as a generic. You need to add a crop oil or an adjuvant with it to help it stick to the plant and get into the plant. So make sure you pay attention to that. And it's better on perennial grasses such as Johnson grass, which we have down here, than what Post is. And Post is the next one, or last one I have. So this is Cisoxadim is the active ingredient. It's for post-emergence, more or less the same things, grasses only. So both of those two have absolutely no injury to broadleaves. It's all for grasses. So that's one really good thing that we can control, is controlling grasses in pumpkins. Can be fairly easily. But so just a quick summary of that. So I know that was a lot of information, but I just wanted to kind of briefly cover them. You can always, for those here, I have handouts if you want to go back and look at those The biggest thing, I included the active ingredients, so that way if you get a generic, you can say, oh, hey, this is what's a part of it, because that's really important to understand and know, because there's so many different trade names out there at times. So anyhow, anyone there, anyone have any herbicide questions, at least at the moment? All right. I'll go ahead and move on to cover crops. So, and this is I have a few pictures from my own production area, and actually I can maybe even dig up a few more later over lunch if you want, if some are interested. Cover crops, I think, are really important, especially for those in some of the organic systems, but I think they're equally important in the conventional systems. So I think I could do an entire presentation just on cover cropping and some of the challenges with that, you know, and more than just even weed control aspects. But most commonly for pumpkins, we have the small grains, so things like wheat, cereal rye, some of the others, triticale, barley. Those are any of the kind of, I would say, wheat-like plants all have pretty good utility for this. Cereal rye does have what we call allelopathy. It does exude some natural chemicals which suppresses other plants from growing around it. So that way it has some extra benefits in addition to the fact that cereal rye produces immense amounts of above ground biomass. So it also has a lot of physical interruption to weeds coming up. The nice thing about wheat, and actually the picture you see there is planted after wheat stubble, is that wheat is a easily profitable commodity crop. So the production system I have to kind of back up and talk about that is I plant pumpkins into a portion of existing wheat field. So basically I uninterrupt a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, and I just come in after the wheat harvest and transplant pumpkins. So in that case, that gives me a 3-year rotation between areas when I have in pumpkin production, and it also gives me the benefit of being able to have harvested basically harvested grain from that wheat, and then getting the profit from that, and then being able to add another crop after that. Now, for you guys up in the Galesburg area, and I haven't tried this up there, you're probably pushing your limits a little bit as far as getting wheat mature and being able to still transplant pumpkins and get a full season. You'd probably have to do a really early maturing wheat variety. I haven't done much work up there. I don't know about the profitability of doing a combined system like that and still harvesting the wheat. You may have to do something similar to, say, I know what Mike does is just using that cover crop as kind of sacrificing it and not necessarily getting a harvest from it. But either way, it's still extremely beneficial.
Nathan, most of the growers that are using the cover crops here are doing the cereal rye in our area.
That's the most common, and I think for me, I transplant pumpkins usually the end of June, so I'll start them around the 8th of June and then transplant them about 3 weeks later. And in that case, that usually gives me pumpkins by around the Labor Day or early September. But there's great differences in, even though we're not terribly far away, in the amount of heat you guys get and how much we get. So we can sometimes get away with things and push the season a little bit more because we can get a little bit more heat and get a little bit quicker production. And so that is one thing to kind of to consider. So with these small grains, the residue is very good at suppressing weeds. So it's a physical barrier for letting those weeds get through. And this residue for these cereal grains can last all season long. So that's there throughout the entire growing season. In addition, as I said, and I think I mentioned this in another slide as well, it's really good for keeping the fruit clean. There is nothing, in my opinion, worse than a muddy, dirty pumpkin. It's one thing if you have 2 or 3 in your home garden, but how would you like to have to wash every pumpkin you sell if you have a couple acres of pumpkins or trying to sell at markets? It's a lot of extra hassle and expense, and as you know, if you get a nice tilled loose soil, and you get a rain on it, and you have these fruits sitting on the soil, it just makes them very muddy. Also, with the cover crops, it's really nice is because in a no-till situation, I have already harvested, gone out to harvest after a, not that long after a couple-inch rain, and been able to get out in the field with relatively minimal impact. And if you have a tilled field and you're trying to get out there and even just to walk around to pick, if you like picking pumpkins, picking dirty pumpkins and sinking down to your ankles in mud at the same time, then I guess you can do that. But the bottom line is you never know, as Mike said, the weather patterns are kind of crazy. So you never know, is it going to be a dry fall? Then that's not a problem. But by God, if you need to pick pumpkins and you just got a big rain, what are you going to do? So that's some really big advantages that these cover crops have. Legumes are also really good. Some of our legume cover crops, they're a good nitrogen producer, but they do not provide as much weed suppression, mainly because the residue from things like vetch and some of the clovers breaks down very quickly. So that doesn't necessarily last throughout the season as well as some of the small grains would. So what would maybe be an ideal? Maybe a mixture of the two. You get some of the nitrogen production benefits and in addition to the long-lasting residue and weed suppression. So mixtures, I haven't personally had an opportunity to work with mixtures of that. Mike, have you ever done like a vetch or clover with a grain mixture?
No, he says he hasn't.
But that's something that I'm hoping to this year. If the weather and my time cooperates, I'd like to see how that works and see how that does, especially as far as the nitrogen needs, and seeing how it can maybe do some natural supply of nitrogen to the plant. So,
Nathan, we've got a question here.
Okay, sure.
Does it matter what you use? I don't plan on growing very many pumpkins. Could I just use grass clippings? Doesn't matter.
Go ahead. Did you hear that, Nathan?
Yeah, I think I caught that. You basically asked if you could use grass clippings as a mulch for if you had a small area. Certainly, you can use. I mean, you could use straw, baled straw or grass clippings, or some other, organic source that you have for, of a mulch. The nice thing, if you have a larger area, is that I tell people if you grow rye or wheat or something, rather than buying a bale of straw, having to haul it to your farm and spread it out, you can grow the straw into place and spend a fraction of that amount on a bag of wheat or rye and have it in place. But no, certainly you can do that. You can also, one thing I've done kind of on a separate topic, I have done personally is I have a garden. I grew some, not pumpkins, but related watermelons, and I planted cereal rye in. I mean, this is a garden that's maybe 30 by 50, and you could do this on as small area as you want. Plant cereal rye, and actually as far as the termination aspect, especially on the, you can use Roundup to terminate it, but if you get it at just the right time that Mike was talking about, and that's right at flowering, so when you see the little anthers, little pollen on the actual seed heads, but before the seed is formed, that is the perfect time to terminate. You can terminate by rolling it down, and or you can terminate by mowing it off without having to use a herbicide. Some of the studies show that if you get it at that point, or right around that time when it's actually flowering, as we would say on the small grains, what I did was I took a good weed eater with a good sharp cutter blade or good quality string in it, and I just mowed it off right at the ground level. So that way I wasn't chopping it up and mulching it. I wanted that residue in as intact as possible, and I got probably only just a small fraction of the plants that wanted to regrow after that without any herbicides. You might get probably 1% or less grow. Now, if you terminate it earlier than that, the plant isn't fully in a reproductive mode, so therefore it still will try to regrow. Now, if you go too late, then you actually have viable seed produced, and then you get volunteer grain coming up from the seed. So that's why that termination, so even for those of you in the organic side, there are some termination options that aren't necessarily going to require you to use Roundup or something, but also ways you can navigate around having to have volunteer plants that are going to come up and be very much of an issue.
If you want to see how, at least for the people in my area here, if you want to see how this system kind of works, Chris and I actually have a plot at the Monmouth Research Farm this year where we have cereal rye, and we're going to crimp it, and we're no-tilling tomato and peppers into that later this year. So it's a very similar idea to what Nathan's talking about. You want to answer that, how you crimp it, or just me too?
To roll it, I can answer that, and unfortunately I don't have a good picture of it. That was something that I was thinking of a picture of, but I wished I had a picture of. Usually they have a roller, so think of a lawn roller, but rather than just being just a round barrel, what it is there's usually like, I wouldn't say knives, that's not the right word, but there's usually like kind of it's corrugated or has like bars across it, so that way it hits, and every time it hits the ground, it more or less breaks the stem, and so it crimps it, just like you would, if you're thinking of mechanically, like you would crimp a fitting on an electrical fitting or something. So it basically smashes it multiple times, and it breaks that stem, so that way it doesn't come back up. Do you have any other descriptions, Mike? Unfortunately, I don't have a good picture. I have a picture in my head, but I'm trying to get that onto the group. I don't know if I did a good job of describing, but.
Mike just mentioned for the guys that have put up any hay, it's like a hay vine. If
Yeah.
you've ever used one of those. But the key to it is, like, if you use just a lawn roller, without these cleats that Nathan's talking about, you won't kill it. It'll come back. You've got to get that crimp on the stem 2 or 3 times, or that'll keep growing.
And you also have to use the right time.
Right time is, like they said, right before it flowers, you've got to get it. You've got to either crimp it or kill it or something.
I will say, though, that if you get the right timing, especially with cereal rye, you can get away a little bit more with maybe a little bit more flexibility if you don't get a good crimp on it or you just roll it down. Because like I say, I mowed it off, which should be an ideal way for it to regrow. So timing is also critical in that. But yeah, the rolling and crimping is probably the ideal as far as making sure you get a good kill on it. So the next thing, I'll try to run through this fairly quickly here, as I don't have just too terribly many more slides left. What I'm going to do here to set this up, I have 3 different production systems: conventional till, no-till planted, and no-till transplanted. And what I'm going to do is just run through some basics of what you would do in a season and some pros and cons on these. So just as examples, and there's any number of different production systems, you can mix and match some of these concepts, but these are at least some predominant examples. So conventional till pumpkins, you're going to start with a tilled weed-free seed bed at planting. You can use a pre-emergence herbicide to prevent weed emergence. You don't have to, but you can. And then you follow up with hand weeding or spot broadcast of pre-emergence herbicide or post-emergence herbicides, and then also, or you can follow up with just repeated row cultivation. So as the pumpkins are starting to vine out, you'll keep cultivating whatever space you can until you can't get through the rows. So like saying you can insert herbicides into this incorporation or not. So some quick pros and cons, and these aren't all of them, but these are just some of the primary things that come to mind. Advantages, and all of these, you'll see a thing that they're effective if maintained. So the if maintained part, so any of these can work, but there's differing amounts of labor and things needed. So all of these can be viable. It's easy to eliminate weeds for which we don't have good herbicides because we have tillage as an option, at least through part of the time of year. Disadvantage, this is a big one. Tillage will bring up new flushes of weeds. If you have what we call a stale seed bed or something and you just apply a herbicide, that's where the key with some of these no-till systems, where you're not working the ground, if you can get those weeds, if you can start clean, you're going to have a better time keeping it clean. If you till it, you're bringing up new weed seeds, and those will continually, you're removing plants that are there, but you're also bringing up new weed seeds. So that's where tillage can be a big issue. It's also more labor intensive because you have more passes through the field, more hand work as far as walking there, hoeing pumpkins. And then the same thing, you start fruit set directly on the soil, and you have higher, just from a conservation standpoint, higher potential for erosion. So this is a tentative plan, a weed management plan for conventional till pumpkins. You can put down a pre-emergence herbicide or not, and you could then follow up with a dual Magnum or strategy or a combination of the two, and you could come back and hand weed or spot spray if needed, select and take care of your grasses, and then Gramoxone would be a potential that you could use to spot spray. Or you could just use repeated cultivation or hand weeding to strictly provide any further weed control. So if you have no-till planted pumpkins, so this would be similar to what Mike does where you're actually planting seeds, you're going to start with a cover crop or heavy crop residue. I've already heard them use just corn residue from the previous year because there's so much residue even using that, even if you don't have a cover crop. You're going to use a burn-down herbicide of some kind, and usually with that a pre-emergence herbicide. And what that's going to do is that's going to give you a clean start and then hopefully give you a continued clean field at least for a little while after planting. So typically in this case you'd be after planting and before emergence, most commonly. Oftentimes this would be followed up by with post-emergence herbicides as needed. Advantages, disadvantages. So again, effective if maintained. No tillage used to bring up new flushes of weeds. To me, this is a really big, important part with the no-till, either the no-till production system. Residue provides added weed control from your cover crop. It's another great way to add another defense against weeds. Less erosion potential. I think that soil health is something we all need to be thinking about in all of our production systems. And fruit are cleaner because they're not setting on the soil. Disadvantage is, yes, it does rely heavily on herbicides, and we currently have limited herbicides labeled and available. Also, when you're direct planting, you have the rodent issue that Mike talked about. Although I will tell you that even though I say it does, we do rely more on herbicides, especially with cereal rye as a cover crop that has so much above ground biomass, even in an organic system. If you manage it right, I think you can still do a no-till system and still have pretty good weed control. Obviously, you're going to be limited to probably things like horticultural vinegar, doing a spot spray, which can be used to, as more or less, it's kind of, I would equate it to similar to a paraquat in activity, and it just doesn't burn to weeds, and you're going to be limited to hand weeding. But I think there is some potential there. So don't feel like you're necessarily stricken to using herbicides. So a management plan, especially a conventional management plan for no-till planted pumpkins, be a burn down or pre-emergence. This is after planting of, say, you could put down Roundup, dual Magnum, and strategy, and then come back later with the post-emergence of Select Max to control your grasses, and then hand weed or spot spray Gramoxone if needed, and that will get you through. No-till transplanted pumpkin. So this usually starts, again, basically same concepts as your no-till planted. You're going to apply your herbicides. This is with cover crops. You're going to apply them before transplanting. So you want to get them before the plants are out there. Because remember, with transplanting, you don't have the opportunity to plant and then not have the plant there, because as soon as you plant, that plant has leaves and it's out there. So you have to do these before transplanting. And follow up with a post-emergence herbicide as needed, and then hand weeding, of course, as we've emphasized, or post-directed or shielded sprays. So, no-till transplanted pumpkins, and you're talking about a picture. This is a picture of my pumpkin production and endeavor. So you can see here's a transplanter in action. You can see how that kind of how that's working. So what you're going to do, advantages fairly similar to, of course, our other no-till systems as cover crops, but plants have a head start on the weed. That's another really nice thing. You have the plants out there, and then from there you have, you can do a burn down or a herbicide before planting, and if you're planting the seeds, it might be another week before you actually have pumpkins up. And so in that same time, you might have a weed come up. Well, in this case, I'm putting a plant out that's already 3 weeks old, and it has a head start. And managing the system in that way and giving them that head start, once pumpkins are established and they have a canopy form, they can pretty well manage for themselves as far as weed control. But it's between that time from planting until the vines can fully close in the rows that weed control is the most important. Similar things with no-till production advantage-wise. It also relies heavily on herbicides, but as I said, that's, there are some options depending on your cover crop that you can manage that. No-till transplanted pumpkins, what would a plan be? So this is a pre-transplant herbicide application. You could say use Gramoxone. That would kill anything that was present at the time, especially if you have mare's tail issues, which I know I do, and that's why I use it. Dual 2 Magnum and Sandia as some residual component. And then post-emergence come back with Select Max. And this is just my own personal preference, I seem to get more usefulness if I use Sandia, more usefulness out of applying it pre. I have applied it post. I honestly don't have very many weeds that I can get good broadleaf control with it post. And I seem to end up with more pumpkin injury than I do weed control, and that's just my own personal preference. But I do think it is beneficial in this spot. And then follow up, again, hand weeding or a spot spray. To kind of sum things up, no matter what you're growing, everyone should have a weed management plan. So your production system depends on the equipment you have. So whether you're going to plant by hand with a hoe, you're going to plant with a modified corn planter, you're going to plant with a transplanter. Any of these things are all things to kind of to consider. But in this case, that's going to limit some of your practices or include some practices in how you're going to do it. Obviously, if you're doing tillage, cover crops are good for soil health, but your cover crops aren't going to provide as much for your weed management. So that, that production system automatically includes or excludes certain management practices. And start the season with a plan. You need to know that weeds are going to be an issue. They're not just, you're not going to escape the weeds one year. They might be a little better or a little worse one year or another, but they're always going to be a problem. So make sure you have a plan going into it. But know that you're going to have to probably adjust that plan, whether it be just using a cover crop. Some years what if your cover crop isn't grow as well and you don't have as much cover crop biomass? That might eliminate that as a viable option. So maybe you need to do more hand hoeing. Maybe you need to make more shielded herbicide applications. Maybe rainfall doesn't get on your pre-emergence herbicide, so it doesn't work as effectively. So you need to know that it's not always going to work out just like you planned, but you can make it work. In summary, weed control is really a very essential component to attain the best yields and also best quality fruit. And no matter what your production system, you need to incorporate many different management tactics together. That way you'll get the most effective control. Herbicides, hand weeding, cover crops, etc. These are all things that work together. I don't think you can just use one and be necessarily effective. Your best is to try to use as many as possible. And overall, good weed management in pumpkins is not simple no matter how you grow them. So in other words, you're always going to have to hand weed. There is no quick fix, but it can be done successfully. So with that, I'll entertain any questions.
Yeah, we got a question here, Nathan.
Okay.
Does no-till have any beneficial effect as far as diseases, powdery mildew, or anthracnose, or anything like that?
So the question was, does no-till have influence on diseases? And Mike, feel free to chime in if you have any other thoughts on this. My overall impression of species, especially on some of them, if you're using cover crops and you don't have that pumpkin directly in contact with the soil. Now, some of our pathogens aren't soil-borne, but if you just think, if you have that pumpkin directly sitting in wet soil, it's just, to me, it's just asking for, you know, a wet, loose, tilled soil. You're asking for more potential for having other issues as far as, you know, pathogens, especially on the fruit. I don't know as far as bacterial spot if there's any advantages to no-till or having cover crops. It certainly doesn't hinder any of those. As far as your things like powdery mildew and things, I don't think it has a great influence another on that. It's not going to be of a great benefit in my opinion anyhow.
Okay, thanks, Nathan.
Sure.
Any other questions? Yes, got another one.
You put the cereal rye in, do you drill it or do you broadcast it, or how's that?
The question was on how do you establish your cereal rye, and basically what most people are going to do is they're going to drill it. Mike, have you ever broadcast cereal rye?
You can broadcast rye on Solid Creek in Rainbow as well.
Right, that's true. Yeah, I mean, if you have a small area, you could broadcast and you'd be fine. Yeah. Another one, Nathan.
I just a quick comment on the broadcasting. Wheat, I haven't had as much success, but especially cereal rye, I've broadcasted, and sometimes I'll try to run like a rake or something over it if there's residue to try to get it incorporated a little bit, or roll it if it's in tilled soil. But I think that can be a viable option. I would say the best, though, if on a larger scale, would be to drill it. So if you're in a garden, could you broadcast it? Yes. If I had, quarter, half acre, acre, multiple acres, I would try to drill it.
Okay. Got another one, Nathan.
If you didn't get your cereal rye established in the fall, can you still establish it in the spring?
If you didn't get cereal rye established in the fall, can you do anything in the spring?
Planting a regular winter cereal rye wouldn't be as beneficial. You could plant oats. That's the first thing. Spring oats would be, and that can be planted early in the spring, and that can give you good biomass. In my opinion, the residue from oats doesn't last as long as the residue from like cereal rye or wheat. It's not as hard. It breaks down quicker. But the oats can still be a very viable option. So if your fall planting failed or for whatever reason you weren't able to get it of a rye or wheat, oats I think would probably be your next best bet, and that could be planted earlier in the spring, and you could get full growth of the oats probably before you're going to plant pumpkins, at least if you're able to get it planted early in the season.
And what I'd add with my experience with oats and what we've done at the research farm is you're going to want to plant a pretty high rate. I mean, at the research farm, we went as high as 3 times the rate, to get a good amount of biomass out there that he's talking about for the weed control.
I would agree with that you would probably want to plant somewhere in around probably close to, 100 pounds per acre or more if you were solely relying on that, especially if you're in an organic system where you wanted to rely solely on that. Oats just doesn't give you quite as much biomass. So.
And the question was about crimping oats. I've never crimped oats before. We've always ended up actually just since they're in annual, we've mowed them off.
The sickle mower work?
Sure, yep.
And just something to add with that, with the cover crop termination, I didn't have a picture of this. What I do on the wheat just to help get the, this isn't for termination, just to get more residue on the ground, is I run a sickle mower over all the wheat stubble to get it on the ground where it's most beneficial. And you could do that. That's although sickle mowers can be somewhat cantankerous at times, they do it, or a disc mower would also work. They do a good job of cutting the residue but not destroying it, like a rotary mower would, and chopping it up, because you always want to keep as much of that residue there as possible.
Thanks.
All right.